All right, I'm joined by the chairman of the Missouri Democratic Party, Roy Temple, who's joining us on this Google Hangout today. Chairman, thank you so much for your time today.
Good to be with you.
We're going to talk a little bit about the elections, of course, taking place this year, the primary coming up in August, and then we had the elections in November. And what I wanted to talk to you about, of course, there are a lot of races on the ticket this year, but I wanted to focus with you early on in this interview on the state legislative races. I know your party would like to take back some seats in the House and the Senate in Missouri, where both the Republican Party in both of those chambers has had a supermajority, or at least in this last session, a majority in the House. And you're focused on those two chambers, aren't you?
That's correct, Mike. That's where the real opportunity to do productive work this election is in those legislative races, and we're very focused on that task.
And that's not to say that you're ignoring the other state offices and the congressional seats that are out there, and we'll get to those in a minute. But I want to talk about how you're going to pursue those offices, and I assume that Medicaid will be a key issue.
Well, I think Medicaid is just a great example of where the current majority has worked around an ideological agenda instead of focusing on practical problem solving that would benefit Missouri families, Missouri communities, and Missourians. And so I think Medicaid is a great example of that, but it's not the only one.
I want to talk to you a little bit about that issue, though, and you know, Republicans, some of them have been offering their own plans, even since the session's end. You've got a couple of other House Republicans who have come out and said, well, we're leaning more towards moving forward with this issue. Do you think that those are legitimate efforts, or are those efforts to try and undermine that as a campaign issue this year?
Well, I think they've recognized that they've taken a politically untenable position. They have taken that position not because opposing Medicaid expansion is good for Missouri, but they've taken it because they viewed it was in their political interest. The politics of that has now changed. People have now recognized that this isn't about whether you're for or against the Affordable Care Act. This is about whether or not you want Missouri, the tax dollars that Missourians pay in federal taxes going to New York and California to provide health care instead of providing it to Missourians. And so as they've come to realize that that is a case that can be made against them, that they can be held accountable for their failure to act and for the harm that they've inflicted on Missourians in terms of health care, and also for the foolishness in terms of how they've failed to shepherd Missouri's tax resources, then I think they've shifted their rhetoric on it. But I don't think, that's far too little, far too late.
You can't say that I've heard this from any of the Republicans that I know are running this year, but I have heard at least one say that the recent troubles that have come to light with the VA program are further evidence why Missouri should not just expand Medicaid. They still advocate for reform. Do you think there's a connection between those two issues?
Well, I think it's an absurdity to suggest that those things are mutually exclusive. I mean, you can take the money and also reform the programs. And I mean, I think on the VA point, they do not get to starve a system of resources for decades. Oppose efforts to improve the funding stream that would allow. I mean, look, you have a backlog because you don't have sufficient resources to provide services to the population you have. So the Republicans have been a huge part of a very chronic underfunding of the VA administration, and for them to suddenly claim that that is a result of a Democratic administration is a silly notion. But as it relates to Medicaid, particularly, those are not mutually exclusive options, and they shouldn't get by with the rhetoric as if they are. You can take that funding and you can make reforms to the program, and those can be pursued simultaneously, not sequentially.
I want to talk to you, too, about what support you expect from some of your other key office holders. The House Minority Leader, Jim Clement, in the session that he is expecting a lot of support from Governor Nixon in some of these statewide legislative offices, the state legislature offices that are up, and he's anticipating the governor going out and as I took him to mean, campaigning on behalf of some of the state representative Democrats who are running for state legislative offices. What are you anticipating from Governor Nixon in those races?
Well, I think Governor Nixon clearly understands the harm that's being inflicted by the current supermajorities in the General Assembly. In fact, there's a fair argument that he understands it better than any other person in the state of Missouri because he has to deal with the consequences of their actions more directly than perhaps anyone else. I don't know the specifics of the ways in which he plans to engage this election cycle. That is yet to be determined, but he has already participated in political campaign events on behalf of key candidates, and I suspect that he will engage in further activities. Of course, his first priority is always to do his job as governor, and that is the right thing for him to do. And beyond that, that has to be determined on a case-by-case basis. But he understands the problem quite well.
I don't know how many have ever said this publicly, but I feel comfortable saying that at least in private settings, many Democrats, certainly that I've talked to in the legislature, excuse me, in the legislature, have been critical of the governor for not doing more in that area in the past. Do you see this as a change of any kind to be able to expect more from him in this election cycle?
I really have no interest in looking behind me or watching in the rearview mirror. I'm interested in looking forward, and we have an opportunity before us, and I'm trying to marshal every available resource and every person who's willing to assist us in that effort. And to the extent that Governor Nixon's available to do so, we'll try to make sure that those efforts are highly productive, and we'll also welcome the support and activity of others who wish to help us in this endeavor as well.
When I was asking you, I wanted to go back to the governor long enough to ask, have you had communications with him on the subject of the elections this year?
Well, I mean, yes, I've had conversations with him about the elections. I have not had conversations about the specifics of each and every way he plans to engage. But we've spoken generally about the importance of legislative races, and he's shown interest very early on in my tenure as chairman.
Okay, let's talk for a moment along the same lines about Senator McCaskill, and she, in a question on this subject, could not go into detail because she happened to be in one of the Senate buildings in Washington, D.C., but she gave a very short and enthusiastic answer to suggest that she is going to be involved, and I took her to mean that she is very enthusiastic about doing that.
Well, I think there's no question that that's the case. She is very distressed by the makeup of the current supermajorities in the General Assembly, and understands the importance of that quite clearly, and is willing to participate in efforts to help us improve on our current situation. I mean, some might argue that she understands this, both having been a state legislator and also in her last reelection running against someone who used to be a gadfly state legislator and then suddenly became a congressman, and those of us who saw him know he was just as extreme when he was in the legislature. It was only when he said those things on television that suddenly the national focus came to him, and others recognized the danger he posed. But many of us in Missouri have known it for a long time.
What does it mean to have the support of not just Senator McCaskill, Governor Nixon? You've got a couple of other state elected officials that one would assume will have a role as well. How important is that in those state offices?
Well, I mean, it's vitally important. I mean, I think there's both the affirmative benefit, and then there's the problem you don't have. You don't have the problem of trying to get people of trying to talk people into engaging. They're already interested. You don't have people trying to talk you into focusing your attention on other things. Instead, everyone is united around the common purpose of making those gains that are within our grasp. And they're making helpful suggestions about how we can do that, and they're committing to do important work that can help us advance on that task. So it is a good set of circumstances. As with most things in life, it'll be what we make of it, but it is good to start from where we're starting from rather than places I can imagine us starting from.
Does a party set a goal? Do you have a number in mind of this is the number of House seats, this is the number of Senate seats that we want to get back this year?
I mean, sure. Yeah, you think in terms of what's possible, and you speak of the upper limit possibilities, and you think about worst case scenarios, and then the last thing you do is you don't talk to them about reporters.
Fair enough. Let's talk about some of the other races. Of course, there are several congressional seats that are up. What does last Tuesday's primary results? Obviously, other states holding their primaries last week, but you had some major changes take place already in the primaries that took place last week. Do those send any signals to you?
Well, yes, it does. I mean, less important than the outcome of the Cantor congressional seat is perhaps the almost universal reaction from Republicans about the Cantor loss, and that is that their response seems to be that they must continue to appease the extreme element of their party, the Tea Party, in order out of fear that they might otherwise get a primary from the right. I think that they would be much better off to stand up to them, point out when they're being extreme, and in fact focus on the problem solving that voters across the political spectrum both want and expect from their elected officials. So I think they have revealed in their reaction to that that they are captured by that extreme element of their party. We've seen it time and time again in the state legislature. The state legislature here is dominated by people of that same ideological spectrum, that same narrow element of the ideological spectrum. And it is less, in some ways, it is less the absurd positions that they chase after that is harmful. It is all the realistic problems that they ignore as a result of that focus on these narrow and extreme agenda items of this very selective group of within their party. And so it is disturbing to see both, how hyper responsive they are to the more extreme elements of their party. Is the short version.
Having said that, at least a few of our congressional members have at least some ties, some of them very strong ties to the Tea Party movement. How can you, or do you think you can capitalize on what happened last week?
Well, I think in terms of winning congressional seats, it's very, very difficult. I mean, the reality is that those seats have been drawn to make it nearly impossible for a Democratic challenger to prevail. It's not impossible, but it's very, very difficult. And so, we'll have to do as well as we can with the candidates that we have and look for opportunities in the future. But, that is not the place of greatest opportunity for us, being quite candid.
The ballot issues that have been moved, the positioning of those. First of all, let's look at the primary. And maybe the key issue on that is going to be the transportation tax, but there's 5 issues on that ballot. Any of those that jump out at you as helping or hurting you in the primary, and the ones then that are left in November, what are your thoughts on how those have been positioned?
Well, I don't spend a lot of time dreaming in counterfactuals, what might have been. I sort of deal with the reality that faces me, and the reality is that there's an August ballot, a November ballot, and you got to sort of factor that in. I think, if history is any guide, people might be surprised to learn that what shapes the August ballot may not, in fact, be the transportation tax at all. It may, in fact, be the gun measure. If you look at the turnout patterns from the concealed weapon battle in 1999, it was on an April ballot. There was nothing else that would have caused people to turn out, and the number of people that voted in that election far exceeded the number that typically show up in an April or in an August election. I mean, radically exceed what you would normally see in an April election, and significantly exceeded what you'd normally see in August. So, in some ways, that may be the driver of turnout on the August ballot. But the transportation tax will stimulate interest. There will probably be funding to communicate about that. So that could be what drives the discussion. But there's in some ways in terms of our legislative races, we don't have a large number of competitive primaries to deal with, and we're mostly focused in terms of the legislative races on the general elections in November. So that's less of a factor.
Maybe another one.
I don't particularly see anything on the November ballot that I think is going to radically change turnout patterns from what you would normally see in a midterm election. But you can always be surprised in this business. But nothing on its face jumps out to me as going, "Oh my goodness, that's a wild card."
Could be another one of those issues that you don't talk about with reporters. But I'm maybe in general terms, it's certainly something like the transportation tax. And you've, of course, had Governor Nixon come out and say he opposes it. I know there were lawmakers who opposed that when it came up in the legislature. Is that something that works its way into campaigns?
Well, I mean, I think as you say, there are Democrats who are on who have various viewpoints on that issue, and in any particular race, it could certainly be a factor, depending on the makeup of the Democrats' viewpoint, the Republicans' viewpoint, and whether there's a difference. But I don't think it'll be some broad thematic that's used as a central campaign issue in every legislative race. In that way, I doubt it will emerge in that sense.
Roy, thank you. Enjoyed regarding our guest, and I thank you for your time. Let me give you a chance because August will be here before we know it. Any final thoughts that you want to share with me or with Missouri voters?
No, I think the most dangerous thing to the Republican supermajorities would be an engaged electorate that is paying attention to the mischief they've been up to since they've taken the supermajorities. And so I would just encourage all Missouri voters to pay close attention to what their legislature is doing or not doing. And if you're happy with what you're getting, vote to get more of that. If you think it's time to shuffle the deck a little bit and create some change, then I think you ought to give your Democratic candidates a close look.
Roy Temple has been our guest. Thank you so much for your time today.
You bet. Thanks, Mike.
This has been Mike Lear on this Google Hangout for MissouriNet.